The dark story of how the Playboy mansion transformed luxury into human decay begins on a winter night in 2017, when the lights of America's most famous mansion finally went out for the last time. It was January. The cold cut through the Holmby Hills like a silent blade. Inside the wrought-iron gates that guarded that empire of stone and fantasy, something had changed irreversibly. The windows were dark. The pool was covered in leaves. The empty halls echoed a silence that not even decades of music, laughter, and champagne could erase. Hugh Hefner had died 3 months earlier, and with him died the last illusion that that place was only about pleasure, freedom, and carefree luxury. Because the Playboy Mansion was never just a house, it was a social experiment, an architectural statement of power. A stage where dreams were enacted under carefully adjusted lights, while behind the scenes, away from the cameras and parties, an invisible machine operated, made of labor, control, money, and above all, human sacrifice. Look at the old photos. See the perfect lawn, the marble fountains, the smiling women around the pool, always young, always available, always beautiful. Everything seems spontaneous, natural, free. But ask yourself, who maintained that perfect lawn? Who cleaned the halls after the parties that lasted until dawn? Who paid the bills when the magazines started to decline? And most importantly, who was truly free within those walls? The answer isn't on the magazine covers. It's in the confidentiality agreements, in the testimonies given decades later, in the memories that were silenced for years. It's in the stark difference between what was seen and what was lived. This is the story of how an American dream turned into a gilded cage, of how the promised freedom became the most sophisticated prison Hollywood has ever known, of how luxury, when taken to the extreme, ceases to be pleasure and becomes a form of control, and how, in the end, all great beauty demands a price not always paid by those who admire it. Before we delve into the corridors of this mansion and uncover its darkest secrets, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever wondered what the price would be of living in a place where your dreams come true, but your freedom disappears? Leave a comment. Would you live in the Playboy Mansion knowing everything we're about to reveal? And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now's the time, because we're going to investigate the stories that luxury tries to hide. Now let's go back to the beginning, to the moment when it all started, when an empty mansion in Los Angeles would become the center of an empire and of a tragedy that would last for decades. It was 1971. Hugh Hefner was 45 years old, owned the world's best-selling men's magazine, and was about to do something no publisher had ever done: transform his brand into a physical place. Not just an office, not just a studio, but a world. He bought the mansion for $1. $1 million, an astronomical sum at the time, equivalent to almost $8 million today. The property had 2 acres of land in the most exclusive hills of Los Angeles, Holmby Hills, where neighbors included the Spelling family, the Bing Crosbys, and the unseen elite of Hollywood. The house itself was a 1920s Gothic revival building, originally designed by Arthur R. Kelly for a department store magnate. It had 29 rooms, including a private movie theater, an underground wine cellar, libraries with oak paneling, marble staircases, and stained glass windows imported from Europe. But Hefner didn't just buy it to live in. He bought it to create a symbol. And then the transformation began. In the following months, millions of dollars were poured into the property. The pool was redesigned and expanded, gaining an artificial grotto with a waterfall, underwater lighting, and an integrated sound system. Around it, sculpted gardens, Portuguese stone paths, Renaissance fountains, and an outdoor seating area with capacity for 200 people were built. A private zoo was set up on the property. Yes, a zoo, with peacocks, flamingos, monkeys, parrots, and for years, even a pair of llamas. Hefner wanted the mansion to resemble Eden, a place where the rules of the ordinary world didn't apply. Inside the house, every room was redecorated. Persian rugs, baccarat crystal chandeliers, original works of art by Dali and Picasso. There was an entire room dedicated to games, pool tables, pinball, arcade games, all equipped before the video game era even exploded. Another room was just for displaying Hefner's collection of pipes, hundreds of them arranged like museum pieces. But the real secret was in the private wing. On the second floor, away from the eyes of the guests, was Hefner's master bedroom, a gigantic suite with a built-in sound system in the walls, a retractable movie screen on the ceiling, a rotating round bed in the center, and a marble bathroom with a bathtub for 4 people. The curtains were operated by remote control. The temperature was zoned. And there were security cameras in strategic locations, which, according to reports, Hefner used to monitor the entire house. This was the dream, the visual promise, the fantasy sold to the world, a life where pleasure, art, beauty, and freedom coexisted in perfect harmony. And it worked. When the Playboy Mansion opened its doors for its first parties in 1971, all of Hollywood wanted to be there. Directors, actors, musicians, athletes, politicians, everyone was photographed around that pool, drinking French champagne, chatting with scantily clad models, laughing under the California sun. The images were published in the magazine, broadcast on television, and reproduced in newspapers around the world. The message was clear. This is the life you want, and it exists. Here, in the following years, the mansion became the stage for some of the most legendary parties in American history. The annual Halloween party, where celebrities appeared in costume, and the mansion was decorated like a luxurious haunted castle. The themed parties, Roman nights, Venetian masquerade balls, pajama parties broadcast live on TV. Each event cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Each event was a performance, and people believed it. Millions of Playboy readers around the world looked at those photos and thought, he did it. He built paradise. But let's pause here. Let's look again. Because if you pay attention, you'll start to notice something. In all those photos, in the dozens of documentaries, in the TV specials, there's always a strategic absence. You see the parties, you see the guests, you see Hefner in a bathrobe, surrounded by young women smiling at the camera, but you don't see who's cooking the food, who's serving the drinks, who's cleaning the bathrooms the next day, who's mowing the lawn, who's coordinating the logistics of bringing 200 people onto a private property every week. You can't see the machine, because the uncomfortable truth about any big dream is this: it doesn't sustain itself. It needs fuel. It needs invisible work. It needs people willing to give up their own lives so that others can live the fantasy. And at the Playboy Mansion, that machine was gigantic. On average, there were between 30 and 50 employees working full-time on the property. Gardeners, security guards, cooks, drivers, cleaners, personal assistants, event coordinators, audio and video technicians, veterinarians for the zoo, bartenders, valets. They all woke up early, worked long hours, and returned home long after the guests had already left, and almost none of them appeared in the photos. This is the first layer of the invisible cost of luxury. It requires someone, somewhere, to be working while you relax, that someone is cleaning while you make a mess, that someone is organizing while you improvise. But that was just the beginning, because the true price of the Playboy Mansion wasn't being paid by the employees. It was being paid by the women who appeared in the photos, those who were portrayed as free, happy, empowered, those who lived there, who lived under the same roof as Hefner, who shared his bed, his dinners, his parties, those who signed exclusivity contracts, who received monthly allowances, who had curfews, who needed permission to leave, who were photographed, filmed, monitored, controlled, and who, for decades, were forbidden from telling their stories. They were called girlfriends. But what were they really? Let's find out. Because to understand what happened inside that mansion, We need to dig deeper. We need to go behind the scenes. We need to look at the invisible machine that kept the dream alive, and at the human gears that were crushed in the process. You wake up at 6 in the morning. It's still dark outside. You descend the stairs of the west wing of the mansion, where the girlfriends' bedrooms are located, and walk silently through the marble corridors. You can't make a sound. Hefner is still sleeping, and when he sleeps, the entire house must respect the silence. You go to the kitchen, not to prepare your own breakfast. That's the job of the cooking team, who have been there since 5 in the morning, preparing the special coffee that Hefner drinks every morning, always in the same way. Black, hot, served in a specific Chinese porcelain cup. You're there because you need to check your schedule for the day. It was left the night before by one of Hefner's personal assistants, printed on letterhead with precise times. Photo session at 10 a.m. Mandatory lunch with the guests at noon. Appearance at the party in the evening. Dress already chosen and hanging in your closet. Curfew, 9 p.m. Unless Hefner requests your presence in the master suite, in which case you stay. Welcome to the routine of a girlfriend at the Playboy mansion. For decades, Hugh Hefner was portrayed as a sexual liberator, the man who challenged American Puritanism, who championed freedom of speech, who created a space where women could be sensual without shame. And on a certain level, that was true. But what wasn't said, what was actively hidden for years, was the level of control Hefner exerted over the women who lived with him. Holly Madison, one of Hefner's most famous girlfriends who lived in the mansion between 2001 and 2008, revealed years later in her memoir disturbing details about life within those walls. She described a rigid system of unwritten but inflexible rules. The girlfriends received a weekly allowance of $1,000, generous at first glance, but which came with conditions. They could not have outside jobs. They could not leave the mansion without notice. They could not bring friends or family without prior approval. They could not use cell phones during meals with Hefner, and above all, they could not have romantic relationships with other people. Hefner, on the other hand, had 7 girlfriends at the same time. Holly described how the nights worked. All of Hefner's main girlfriends were expected in his room twice a week. They went up together, following a specific order. According to the accounts, the encounters followed a rigid and predictable pattern, described by them as mechanical and dehumanizing. There was no spontaneity. There was no real choice about whether to participate or not. And then they would go back to their rooms. Kendra Wilkinson, another famous girlfriend, also described the routine. She said there was a strict curfew, 9 o'clock at night. If you weren't back at the mansion by that time, the gates would close. And if you stayed out, you risked losing your place in the house hierarchy, or worse, being kicked out. Isabella St. James, who lived in the mansion between 2002 and 2004, revealed that Hefner kept a notebook where he wrote down information about each of his girlfriends, what they liked, what they didn't like, how they behaved, who was more obedient, who caused problems. It was, in her words, a control system disguised as intimacy. But why did they stay? That's the question everyone asks, and the answer is complex. For many of these women, the Playboy mansion was the gateway to something bigger. Holly Madison wanted to be an actress. Kendra Wilkinson dreamed of fame. Bridget Marquardt sought a career in media. The mansion offered visibility, connections. The TV show The Girls Next Door, which showed the lives of Hefner's girlfriends, aired in prime time and was watched by millions. Living there meant being part of something iconic. But there was a cost, and that cost was measured in autonomy. Many of his ex-girlfriends described a feeling of isolation. Inside the mansion, you were always surrounded by people, staff, guests, other girlfriends. But you had no privacy. You had no space of your own. Everything you did was observed, commented on, judged. Hefner knew everything. His assistants knew everything. And if you displeased him, the consequences were swift. Holly Madison recounted that she once tried to leave the mansion. She was exhausted, emotionally drained, questioning whether it was really worth it. She went to Hefner and said she needed some time. He didn't yell. He didn't kick her out. He simply looked at her and said, "If you leave, you'll never be anything again. Nobody will remember you." She stayed for another 3 years. That's the power of a gilded cage. It doesn't need locks. It works through the fear of invisibility, through the promise that if you stay, you might get something, and through the implicit threat that if you leave, you'll lose everything. But the girlfriends weren't the only people trapped in that system. There was another layer of control, less visible but equally rigid: the employees. The staff at the Playboy Mansion were highly professional and incredibly discreet. Everyone signed confidentiality agreements that prohibited them from speaking about what they saw or heard inside the property. These contracts were reinforced by legal threats. Any violation would result in multi-million-dollar lawsuits. And what did they see? A former security guard who worked at the mansion between 1998 and 2005 gave an anonymous interview years later. He described how the parties worked. He said that before each event, the staff received detailed instructions about who could enter which areas. There were restricted zones. Certain rooms were only for VIP guests. Others were exclusive to Hefner and his girlfriends. And there was always a security team monitoring live cameras throughout the property. He also revealed something even more disturbing. There was a control room in the mansion's basement, equipped with monitors that transmitted feeds from cameras installed at strategic points in the house. These weren't ordinary security cameras. They were aimed at the hallways, the garden, and the pool. And according to him, there were also cameras in the girlfriend's area. Hefner publicly denied this, but several ex-girlfriends confirmed that they always felt like they were being watched. The cleaning crew worked in shifts. One team would come in at 6 in the morning and clean until noon. Another would come in the afternoon and prepare the house for the evening parties. And a third team would come in after the parties ended, often at 3 or 4 in the morning, and clean up the mess. Broken bottles, scattered food, stains on the carpets, cigar ash on the velvet sofas. They couldn't talk to the guests. They couldn't take photos. They couldn't ask questions. They were, in the words of a former employee, ghosts with brooms. And how much did they earn? Less than you might think. Most of the cleaning and gardening staff earned between $12 and $15 an hour, slightly above the California minimum wage, but nothing compared to the cost of living in Los Angeles. Many of them traveled more than an hour to reach the mansion. They worked double shifts, and they returned to modest homes, far removed from the luxury they helped maintain. This is the brutal paradox of extreme luxury. The more perfect it seems, the more invisible work is hidden behind it. And the more invisible that work is, the easier it is to ignore it. But the invisible work wasn't just physical. It was also emotional, psychological, because inside the Playboy Mansion there was a hierarchy. And that hierarchy was cruelly clear. At the top, Hefner. Right below him, his primary girlfriends. Then the secondary girlfriends. Then the VIP guests. Then the trusted employees. And at the bottom, everyone else. And if you were at the bottom, you felt it. You knew it didn't matter, that you were replaceable, that your function was to keep the machine running, but never to appear in the picture. Holly Madison described what it was like to be in the middle of that hierarchy. She said that even as one of the main girlfriends, she always felt like she was competing. Competing for Hefner's attention, competing for the best position in photos, competing not to be forgotten, and that this constant competition created a toxic environment where true friendships were impossible, because they all knew, if you hesitated, someone else would take your place. And then you begin to understand. You begin to see what that place really was. Not a paradise, but a power structure disguised as a party, a control machine disguised as freedom, an empire built on the labor, silence, and obedience of hundreds of people, all kept in line by money, contracts, and the promise that, if they endured, perhaps one day they would be rewarded. But who designed this machine? Who decided it should work this way? And more importantly, why did he believe this was acceptable? To answer that, we need to look at the man who created all of this. We need to understand the mind behind the mansion, because Hugh Hefner wasn't just an editor. He was a visionary, a manipulator, a dreamer obsessed with control, and his story is as complex as the mansion he built. Hugh Marston Hefner was born on April 9, 1926, in Chicago, Illinois, to conservative Methodist parents. His mother, Grace, was a teacher. His father, Glenn, was an accountant. They raised Hugh and his younger brother, Keith, in a strict environment where physical affection was rare and expressions of sexuality were treated as sinful. Hefner described his childhood as emotionally barren. He said in interviews throughout his life that his mother never hugged him, that he grew up feeling invisible, that he developed an early obsession with creating a world where he could be seen, admired, loved, even if it was a fabricated love. At 15, he started drawing fictional magazines. He created covers, invented articles, illustrated stories. He dreamed of being an editor, but not of just any magazine. Of a magazine that defied the rules, that was scandalous, that made people look. After serving in the army during World War II, Hefner returned to Chicago and began working for small publications. He was a freelance writer, assistant editor, and illustrator. But nothing satisfied him. He wanted something of his own, something that carried his name, his vision. In 1953, at the age of 27, he founded Playboy. The first edition was printed in December 1953, with Marilyn Monroe on the cover, a nude photo of her that Hefner bought from an old calendar for $500. The magazine sold over 50,000 copies in its first week, and Hefner realized something powerful. There was a huge market for this, a male audience that wanted to see nudity, but in a sophisticated way, not cheap pornography, but classy eroticism. In the following years, Playboy exploded in popularity. In the 1960s and 1970s, the magazine sold millions of copies a month. Hefner became a celebrity. He appeared on TV. He defended civil rights. He funded progressive causes. He became a symbol of sexual freedom and cultural rebellion. But something interesting happened along the way. As the empire grew, Hefner began to withdraw from the world. He bought the first Playboy mansion in Chicago in 1959, and he began to live there, completely. He rarely went out. He worked in his pajamas. He received guests, held meetings, ran the magazine, all from inside the mansion. Then, in 1971, he moved to Los Angeles and bought a second mansion, and it was there that he truly locked himself away. For more than 40 years, Hefner lived almost exclusively inside the Playboy mansion. He would leave perhaps once a year. All his meetings took place there, all his dinners, parties, and gatherings. He created a closed world where he was the absolute king, and where everything functioned according to his rules. But why? Why would a man who championed freedom choose to lock himself away? Why would someone who preached spontaneity create such a rigid system of control? The answer lies in Hefner's psychology, and it's darker than it seems. In several interviews, Hefner admitted that his greatest insecurity was aging. He was terrified of getting old, of losing relevance, of being forgotten, and the mansion became his way of freezing time. Inside, he could control everything. The age of the women around him, always between 18 and 25. The music that played, always from the 1960s and 1970s. The films shown, old classics, which he had already seen dozens of times. He lived in a time loop, and the older he got, the more desperately he clung to that loop. His ex-girlfriends described how Hefner had obsessive routines. He always woke up at the same time. He ate breakfast the same way. He watched the same movies. He played the same games, and he expected the people around him to adapt to these routines without question. Holly Madison recounted that Hefner had a constant need for validation. He wanted to be praised. He wanted his girlfriends to say he was attractive, intelligent, funny. And if they didn't, he would become distant, cold, manipulative. She also revealed something disturbing. Hefner frequently told his girlfriends that they were lucky to be there, that other women would give anything to be in their place, that they should be grateful. This is a classic tactic of psychological control, making the person feel that their position is a precarious privilege that can be taken away at any moment, and that, if they don't behave, they will lose everything. But Hefner didn't see it as control. He saw it as protection, as care. He genuinely believed he was offering the women a better life, that they were happier with him than they would ever be alone, and perhaps he even believed it, because Hefner had a very clear narrative about himself. He saw himself as a revolutionary, as a defender of freedom, as someone who had challenged American Puritanism and won, and the mansion was living proof of that victory. It was evidence that he was right, that his way of doing things worked. But there was a fundamental contradiction at the heart of this narrative. Because Hefner advocated sexual freedom, but only on his terms. He wanted women to be free to be sensual, to pose nude, to celebrate their bodies. But they weren't free to say no. They weren't free to have relationships with other men. They weren't free to grow old. They weren't free to leave. So what was it, freedom or control? The awkward answer is both. Hefner created a system where women had more freedom than in the conservative society of the 1950s, but less freedom than they would have had outside of his control. It was conditional freedom, freedom under surveillance, and Hefner never managed or never wanted to see the difference. As the years went by, the mansion began to become something different, no longer a symbol of freedom, but a museum of one man's obsession. The parties continued, the girlfriends kept arriving. But something had changed. The world outside was evolving. Conversations about consent, about power, about female autonomy were becoming more complex. And Playboy, slowly, began to seem outdated. The magazine, which sold 7 million copies a month in the 1970s, fell to less than 800,000 in the 2000s. The internet had changed everything. Pornography was available for free, and Hefner's concept, sophisticated nudity, no longer had the same appeal. But he didn't change. He couldn't change, because changing would mean admitting that maybe he was wrong, that maybe the system he had built wasn't perfect, that maybe the women he claimed to be liberating were, in fact, imprisoned. And then the collapse began. Not a sudden collapse, but slow, gradual, almost imperceptible at first, but inevitable, because every empire built on control eventually begins to crack. And when the cracks appear, they reveal something that was there all along, hidden beneath layers of luxury, parties, and forced smiles. They reveal the true cost. The collapse of an empire rarely begins with a dramatic event. There are no explosions. There are no public declarations of defeat. The collapse begins silently, with small cracks that no one wants to admit are there. At the Playboy mansion, these cracks began to appear in the early 2000s. In 2002, Playboy magazine reported its first significant drop in revenue in decades. Sales had plummeted to less than 3 million copies a month, a still impressive number, but alarming when compared to its peak of 7 million. The internet had democratized access to pornography. Free websites offered explicit content without the articles, the interviews, and the pretense of sophistication that Playboy tried to maintain. And young people simply weren't buying magazines. Hefner, then 76 years old, refused to accept reality. He insisted that Playboy was more than pornography. It was culture, it was a lifestyle, it was art. But the market disagreed, and the numbers don't lie. Playboy Enterprises began bleeding money, millions of dollars in losses year after year. The Playboy clubs, which in the 1970s were symbols of prestige in cities around the world, began to close. London, Chicago, New York. One by one, the bunnies from the facades were removed and the buildings sold. But the mansion remained. The parties continued. Hefner continued receiving guests, surrounded by young girlfriends, dressed in silk pajamas, smoking his pipe, smiling for the cameras, as if nothing had changed. But things had changed, and everyone within the property walls knew it. The staff began to notice things. House maintenance was being postponed. Small repairs that used to be done immediately now took weeks, months. The paint on the walls began to peel in some rooms. The Persian rugs, which used to be professionally cleaned every quarter, now went years without proper care. The private zoo was quietly decommissioned. The animals were donated to sanctuaries one by one until only the peacocks remained, roaming freely in the gardens. The pool, the mansion's great symbol, began to show signs of wear. The artificial grotto, with its sculpted stones and integrated waterfall, developed leaks. The water became cloudy more frequently, and eventually the pool was used less and less, not because Hefner didn't want to, but because the cost of maintaining it in the perfect condition of the 1970s was simply unsustainable. In 2009, Playboy Enterprises nearly went bankrupt. The company had to undergo a massive restructuring. Hundreds of employees were laid off. International offices were closed. And for the first time in decades, there were serious discussions about selling the mansion. Hefner panicked. The mansion wasn't just his home, it was his identity. It was physical proof that he had won, that his vision had triumphed. Selling the mansion would be admitting that it was all over, that he had lost. So he did something desperate. He bought time. Using his personal assets and loans, Hefner prevented the sale. He negotiated with shareholders. He made concessions. He agreed to reduce operating costs, and he managed to keep the property, but at a price. The staff was drastically reduced. From 50 full-time employees, the number dropped to less than 20. What did this mean in practice? Fewer gardeners, fewer security guards, fewer cooks, fewer people to keep the illusion going, and the illusion began to crumble. The parties continued, but they were smaller, less extravagant. Fewer important people showed up. A-list celebrities stopped going. It was 2010, and the Playboy Mansion had become, in the eyes of Hollywood, an embarrassing vestige of a bygone era. Those who still went were fading celebrities, attention seekers, and wealthy tourists who paid thousands of dollars for exclusive invitations. Yes, paid invitations. The mansion, which for decades had been a symbol of exclusive access based on status, was now selling tickets, not openly, of course, but through donations to charity events organized by Hefner, where the minimum amount to participate was absurdly high. The dream was being auctioned off. But the collapse wasn't just financial, it was also human. In 2011, one of Hefner's ex-girlfriends, Crystal Harris, left him days before their planned wedding. She was 25, he was 85. She fled to London and gave a devastating interview, saying that sex with Hefner lasted about 2 seconds and that she had never been attracted to him, that it was all a performance, that she was there for the fame, the money, the visibility. And for the first time, the public began to seriously question what was really going on in that mansion. Holly Madison released her memoir, Down the Rabbit Hole, in 2015, and it was devastating. She described in detail the psychological manipulation, the rigid rules, the obsessive control, the curfews, the mandatory meetings in Hefner's bedroom, the toxic competition between girlfriends, the constant feeling of being trapped, and most shockingly, she revealed that Hefner offered sedatives, controlled medications that were commonly distributed informally at the time to his girlfriends before intimate encounters. Holly refused, but she witnessed other women accepting, and she described how visibly disoriented and vulnerable they became. Hefner publicly denied the accusations. He said Holly was making up stories to sell books, but other ex-girlfriends also began to speak out. Kendra Wilkinson confirmed parts of the story. Isabella St. James confirmed others. And slowly, a very different picture of the Playboy Mansion began to emerge. It wasn't paradise, it was a luxury prison, a sophisticated control system disguised as sexual liberation. And then came the Me Too movement. In 2017, Hollywood exploded with allegations of sexual abuse, harassment, and manipulation. Harvey Weinstein was exposed. Dozens of other powerful men fell, and conversations about consent, power, and control finally entered the mainstream. The Playboy Mansion was inevitably drawn into the center of these conversations. Journalists began investigating. Documentaries were produced. The series Secrets of Playboy, released in 2022 by A&E, featured testimonies from more than 50 former employees, ex-girlfriends, and ex-models. And the stories were consistent: control, manipulation, drugs, pressure, fear. A former Playboy bunny who worked at the mansion in the 1980s described how there was implicit pressure for women to always be available to Hefner's important guests. According to her, refusing attention from influential figures was interpreted as disrespect to Hefner. And the professional consequences were immediate. Another woman reported a disturbing incident at one of the mansion's parties. She lost consciousness and woke up hours later in one of the bedrooms, disoriented and with no clear memory of what had happened. She never filed a formal complaint. The circumstances made any investigation extremely difficult. These stories weren't new. They had existed for decades, but they were silenced by confidentiality agreements, by legal threats, by fear of not being believed, and above all, by the power of the public narrative that Hefner had constructed, that he was the liberator, the visionary, the hero of the sexual revolution. But the sexual revolution was never about women's liberation. It was about men's access to women's bodies, and Hefner was one of the architects of this confusion. Meanwhile, the mansion continued to physically crumble. In 2016, after years of negotiations, Hefner finally agreed to sell the property. It was bought by Darren Metropolis, a billionaire businessman, for $100 million. But there was a condition: Hefner could continue living there until his death. He lived another year. Hugh Hefner died on September 27, 2017, at the age of 91, in his bed at the Playboy Mansion. He was surrounded by some of his ex-girlfriends, women who, even after everything, came back to say goodbye to him. Because that's the paradox of manipulation. It can coexist with genuine affection. People can love their abusers. They can feel gratitude for those who controlled them, and that makes it all the more tragic. After his death, the mansion was finally handed over to its new owner, and what he found was shocking. The property was in ruins. Decades of neglected maintenance had taken their toll. The pipes were corroded. The electrical systems were outdated and dangerous. The roofs leaked. The walls were covered in mold. The famous swimming pool was cracked, the water greenish and abandoned. The estimated cost to restore the mansion to its original condition, more than $20 million. Because that's what happens when you cling to an illusion for too long. Eventually, reality catches up with you, and the price is always higher than you imagined. But the collapse of the Playboy Mansion wasn't just physical or financial, it was moral, it was cultural. It was the downfall of an entire narrative about what freedom, luxury, and power mean. And now, with Hefner dead and the mansion closed to the public, one question remains. What do we do with the legacy of such a place? How do we deal with something that was simultaneously revolutionary and abusive, liberating and oppressive, iconic and toxic? The answer lies in what happened next, because the story of the Playboy Mansion didn't end with Hefner's death. It transformed. And that transformation reveals something profound about how societies deal with their own sins, and about what it truly means to learn from the past. When Darren Metropolis bought the Playboy Mansion in 2016, he made sure to make one thing clear publicly. He wasn't going to turn it into a museum, he wasn't going to preserve it as a monument, and he definitely wasn't going to continue the parties. He had other plans. Metropolis owned the property next to the mansion, the former home of the Spelling family, and his intention was to eventually combine the two plots into a single, gigantic private estate. But this would require demolition, reconstruction, and a complete redesign of the space. In other words, the Playboy Mansion, as a physical structure, was doomed. But there was a problem. The mansion was a historical landmark. In 2017, shortly before Hefner's death, the city of Los Angeles declared the property a cultural landmark. This meant that the exterior facade could not be demolished or drastically altered, but the interior was free to be completely transformed. And so it was. In the following years, construction crews moved into the property. They began dismantling decades of history. The halls where legendary parties had taken place were emptied. The furniture was sold at auction. The works of art were distributed among collectors. Hefner's round rotating bed, destroyed. No one wanted to buy it. The grotto of the swimming pool was drained and filled in. The fountains were removed. The zoo, already deactivated, had its structures demolished. The gardens were redesigned. And slowly, methodically, the place that was the Playboy Mansion began to cease to exist. But something interesting happened during this process. As the mansion was physically dismantled, its history was being culturally reconstructed. And this reconstruction was very different from the narrative that Hefner had controlled for decades. In 2022, the documentary series Secrets of Playboy was released, and it had a devastating impact. Millions of people watched it, and for the first time, the public narrative completely changed. The Playboy Mansion was no longer seen as a symbol of sexual freedom. It was seen as a symbol of exploitation, of manipulation, of how power and money can create systems of abuse disguised as glamour. Holly Madison, Sondra Theodore, Mickey Garcia, all these women told their stories, and the public believed them because now, in 2022, in the post-Me Too context, people had the language to understand what had happened in that mansion. They could name it coercion, gaslighting, financial abuse, psychological control. And perhaps most importantly, they could recognize that all of this can coexist with luxury, with parties, with smiles, with superficial consent, because that's the hardest lesson from the Playboy Mansion. Abuse doesn't have to look violent to be devastating. It can look like an opportunity. It can look like generosity. It can look like love. And that's exactly why it's so dangerous. But while the public narrative was shifting, something quieter was happening. The people who worked at the mansion were also speaking out, not to the media, not for documentaries, but amongst themselves, in online forums, in support groups, in private conversations. A former groundskeeper posted on a Reddit forum, "I spent 15 years mowing that lawn. I woke up at 5 in the morning. I worked under the California sun, and never, not once, did Hefner speak to me directly. I was invisible." We all were. A former cleaning employee wrote, "I cleaned up vomit, blood, things I don't want to describe, and after the parties we had to erase all the evidence. It was part of the job, and if we said anything, immediate dismissal, without prior notice. These stories didn't make headlines. They weren't turned into TV series, but they exist. And they matter, because the invisible cost of luxury isn't paid only by the people who appear in the photos. It's paid by everyone who keeps the machine running and who is never seen. Today, in 2026, the Playboy Mansion is a private, gated property. No one enters. No one leaves. There are no parties, no guided tours, no signs indicating what the place once was. It's just a quiet mansion in the Holmby Hills, surrounded by high walls and locked gates. And perhaps that's appropriate, because some places carry so much weight that the only honest thing to do is let them rest, not turn them into museums, not romanticize them, not pretend that the legacy is simple or easily digestible. The Playboy Mansion was many things. It was revolutionary. Yes, it challenged puritanical norms and helped start conversations about sexuality that needed to happen. But it was also oppressive. It was a place where women were controlled, manipulated, and silenced. It was a place where invisible workers sustained an empire without ever receiving credit. It was a place where one man's dream became the prison of hundreds of people, and this complexity is uncomfortable because we, as a society, like simple stories. We like heroes and villains, places that are completely good or completely bad. But the Playboy Mansion forces us to confront something more difficult, that it is possible to create something culturally significant and simultaneously morally flawed, that it is possible to defend freedom publicly while practicing control privately, that it is possible to be both revolutionary and abusive. Hugh Hefner changed American culture. That's undeniable. But he also hurt people, and that's undeniable too. So what do we do with this legacy? In recent years, there have been discussions about what to preserve of Playboy's history. Some argue that the magazine and the mansion should be studied as important cultural artifacts by historians, sociologists, and gender scholars. That it is impossible to understand the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 1970s without understanding the role that Playboy played. Others argue that any preservation is a form of celebration, that we should let Playboy fade from cultural memory, that it doesn't deserve to be remembered. But there is a third option, and perhaps it is the most honest, to remember everything, the good and the bad, the revolution and the exploitation, the luxury and the cost, the promised freedom and the control exercised. Remember without romanticizing. Remember without excusing. Remember so that we may learn. Because the real lesson of the Playboy Mansion isn't about Hugh Hefner. It's not about luxury or parties or decadence. It's about power, about how it operates, about how he disguises himself, about how he seduces. It's about how exploration systems rarely appear exploratory from the outside. They appear as opportunities. They appear as dreams. They appear as choices. And it's about how, if we don't pay attention, if we don't ask the right questions, if we don't listen to the people who were there but never appeared in the photos, we will repeat the same mistakes in different contexts, with different faces, but with the same underlying power structure. Today, Playboy continues to exist as a brand, but it's a shadow of what it once was. The magazine stopped publishing nudity in 2016, and that decision, ironically, summed it all up. The only thing Playboy ever sold, the only thing that made it unique, was removed, because even the company realized that it no longer worked, that the world had changed, that people no longer wanted that version of sexual freedom. But the mansion remains, silent, closed, transformed into something new and private, far from the public eye. And perhaps there's a poetic justice in that, because for decades the Playboy Mansion was about being seen, about appearances, about performance. And now, finally, it's invisible. As always, it was the people who paid the real price to keep it running. If you're watching this now, you've reached the end of this journey. And I imagine you're feeling complicated, maybe even uncomfortable. Because the story of the Playboy Mansion doesn't have a simple moral. It doesn't have a satisfying ending. It doesn't have a clear redemption. She holds only one truth. All great beauty demands a sacrifice. And it is rarely a sacrifice made by those who enjoy it. Perfect gardens require invisible gardeners. Unforgettable parties require workers who clean until dawn. Dreams sold require people willing to give up their own dreams to make them a reality. And absolute luxury, it always demands a human price. The Playboy Mansion was that, a place where dreams were manufactured, where fantasy was carefully constructed, where freedom was staged under controlled lighting. And where, behind the scenes, away from the cameras, away from the magazine covers, away from the public narrative, a ruthless machine of control, money, and power operated. Hugh Hefner believed he had created a paradise. And perhaps, for him, it was. But paradises built on the labor, silence, and obedience of others are never truly paradises. They are merely prisons with pretty decor. And now you know. Now you've seen behind the curtain. Now you understand the real cost. So here's my final question for you. How many other paradises exist around us that operate in the same way? How many brands, how many companies, how many empires are selling dreams while enslaving people behind the scenes? How many places promise freedom but practice control? And most importantly, are you willing to see? Leave a comment below. After everything you've discovered here, would you still admire the Playboy Mansion? Or has it become something different in your mind? And since we're talking about mansions, palaces, and grand places with dark histories, which one would you like me to investigate next? Which famous property hides secrets worth telling? Write it below. Let's find out together. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, share this video with someone who needs to see this, because stories like these don't just disappear on their own, they need to be told, repeated, remembered, so that we never again confuse luxury with freedom, control with care, and glamour with truth, until the next investigation.